Let's jump in here. We are closing out our series called Warriors today. We've been looking at this list in the Bible called David's Mighty Men, and it is one of the coolest lists in the Bible. It lists these guys' names, and it lists some of these really neat little stories, and they just live these enviable, admirable lives. I just want to be like these guys, and that was kind of the goal for us to kind of snuggle up next to these guys, and hopefully it'll kind of rub off on us. And this final week, though, it's going to be a little different. Up until this point, every story has ended with a resounding victory. Week 1, we saw a guy chase a lion down into a pit on a snowy day, and he came out, and the lion didn't. Week 2, we saw 3 guys take on an entire garrison and bring some special water back to camp. Week 3, last week, we saw 2 guys take on an entire army, and one of their swords stuck to their hand. Just amazing stories. And every single one of them was a win, and a win. But today, the guy we're going to look at on David's list is one who lost. And it's a gut-wrenching loss. Honestly, this story is awful. It's an awful story. Like, why are we looking at it then? Well, because we need it. 1, because you're not always going to win in your life. You're not, right? You're going to take one on the chin sometimes. 2, some of us in this room have had some really, really hard things happen in our life. You've had some stuff happen to you that you're sitting there going, I can't make sense of it. Like it's that bad. I can't figure this out. Do you have anything like that in your past where in your life the deeply horrific has happened? The leave you scarred for life has happened. The God, I don't get this. Or the I'm going to walk with a limp for the rest of my life. Do you have anything like that in your past? See, last week we talked about the unlikely victory where victory was snatched from the jaws of defeat. This week, it's the opposite. It's the unexpected defeat. Those times in your life where you didn't expect to lose, losing wasn't even on your radar, you didn't even know you were playing, and all of a sudden, you lost. And you lost ugly. When the bad thing happens and it leaves you reeling. So the question I want to answer today is, how are you going to process those things? Specifically, if you're a follower of Jesus, how do you process your pain? Like the deepest wounds that you have. Those things that you know they're supposed to be scars, but they're actually still bleeding. Those kinds of things. What does faith look like when life punches you in the gut? Now, the guy we're going to look at today is at the very, very end of David's list of mighty men. He made the cut, but just barely. And when I show you his name, if you grew up in church, you're probably going to recognize his name. Not from this list, but from another story. He's actually in another story. That story is incredibly famous, but he's not the main character of the story. His name, he actually gets a whole verse for just his name. 2 Samuel 23, verse 39, Uriah the Hittite. Uriah. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, that one? Yeah, that guy, Uriah. And if you do know who I'm talking about, can you just put the story kind of out of your mind? Because what I want to do, the story, the way it's written is not from his perspective. It's actually from another person's perspective. But in my opinion, that person invades his story rather than him invading their story. So what I want to do is I want to kind of tell it. I want to turn the camera around and put the camera on him. I want to tell the story from Uriah's perspective. So just forget the story if you know it. And if you don't, if you're sitting there going, I don't even know who Uriah is, perfect. Let me tell you about him. The first thing we know about Uriah is that he is a warrior. He's on this list of David's mighty men. That makes him a very powerful warrior, one of Israel's baddest warriors that there is, valiant, battle-hardened. He's a tough guy. Second thing we see just from this verse is that he's not an Israelite. He's a Hittite. And that means a couple of things. The first thing, we could kind of say in our language, you could say, well, he didn't grow up in church. Because he didn't grow up worshiping the God of Israel. He would have grown up in whatever the Hittites were doing. So he didn't grow up worshiping that God. He was brought into it. And that's kind of cool to know that, hey, this wasn't something he was born into. And the second thing we see is that that means he chose to be loyal to Israel. He chose to be loyal to Israel's king. He chose to be loyal to Israel's God. He wasn't born into it. And there's something to that. You know, somebody who sees that kind of a thing and they choose it rather than just being born into it and kind of growing up in it. So I appreciate him for that. And then another important thing to know about Uriah is that he is married to a stunner. She is gorgeous. Me and Uriah have this in common. You haven't been in any of the services up to this point. I've told that joke 3 times now. It's not a joke. Anyways. His wife, here, I'll give you a specific detail. Even from a distance, she's striking. And we know that. You're like, how do you know that? You'll see in the story that even from a distance, she is beautiful. So Uriah's story is recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 11, but we're going to skip most of it because, like I said, it's not about him. The story is told from somebody else's perspective, but I want to only focus on what he would have experienced. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase the story because I have to imagine what it was like from his perspective. So chapter 11 starts off in the springtime. And that's when armies back then would go to war. You don't go to war in the winter. You lose if you go to war in the winter, so they wait till spring. So it's springtime, and they're getting ready for war. They're going to go fight some people. And Uriah, of course, being one of Israel's best warriors, he's getting ready to go. So I want you to imagine what that's like. I don't know if they had a specific date on the calendar, if they just kind of felt it out, but they probably knew it was coming. So you kind of feel the tension growing. Like, all right, it's almost time to go. It's almost time to go. And then I imagine there was one morning he would wake up, and it was the morning he was supposed to leave. And him and his wife wake up, and I don't know, you ever been in mornings like that where it's kind of stressful? I imagine they fought that morning. You know, like he couldn't find his helmet or something, you know, and they fought. The house is messy, and whose fault is that? And they're going back and forth. And you know those kind of fights where it's not really about the thing, it's about the other thing, and they're really just both stressed out and nervous, so they kind of wait at each other. But then, you know, they make up, they hug, and he goes. And they're off to war. And they're marching there, and they get there, and actually the army does really well. Israel is out there, and they're kicking butt. And then just imagine that one night, you know, in between battles, him and his buddies are maybe around a campfire just kind of doing what guys do. Telling stories of battle, reminiscing about home, telling dirty jokes, whatever. You just got to, it's real, right? It's real. So they're sitting there around a campfire just kind of living life, and all of a sudden, the general of the army, his name is Joab, walks into the light of the campfire. And he says, hey, Uriah, the king wants you back home. You need to go report to the king in Jerusalem. He's like, ooh. You know, general walks away, and if you've ever been in a group of guys, like, ooh, you know, like it's like, you got called into the principal's office. Like, they're probably giving him a hard time, but he's excited because he likes the king. He honors the king. He's loyal to the king. Remember, he chose Israel. This is a big deal to him, so he gets the honor of going back, reporting to the king, so he does it. He gets back to Jerusalem, makes his way to the palace, and he stands in front of the king, and that's where we can pick up some of the story in 2 Samuel 11, chapter 7, or 11, verse 7. When Uriah came to him, the king asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. So it's nothing specific. He's just like, hey, give me a mission report. How's everybody doing? How's the generals doing? You know, how was that one battle? Tell me a story. And he's just kind of getting a feel for what's been happening. Then verse 8. Then the king said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. Now, if you just read that, like in our day and age, that's a weird thing to say to another person, isn't it? Hey, why don't you go home and wash your feet? Are you trying to insult me? Like what? I mean, he has been at battle, so maybe that was the thing. But for them, this is kind of his way of saying, hey, why don't you go home and shower up, buddy? Like it's kind of like a go home and enjoy your wife, you know? Like do that, you know? Netflix and chill, like something like that, you know? Like, you know what I'm saying? You guys, is that still a thing? Is it like HBO Max and relax? I don't know. Are you doing different? And here's how I know, because he sends a gift afterwards, and that's like a bottle of wine, scented candles, a Boys to Men CD. Do you understand what I'm saying? This was very much a message to go home and enjoy your wife. That's what's happening here. If you're not like reading between the lines, that's what's happening. So he doesn't live far from the palace. I mean, within a stone's throw from the palace. He is like right there. But he walks out the door of the palace and he stops. And something happens inside of him. And here's what he does. Verse 9. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. What? Dude, you're right there. Like, you can see your house. All of the comforts of home, your bed, your wife, all of that, it's all there, dude. What are you doing? Why would you not go there? So the king calls him back the next morning and asks that very question in verse 10. Haven't you just come home from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home? Don't you miss home in like every way you can miss it? What's up, dude? By the way, side note, isn't it weird how interested the king is in this? A little suspicious. Verse 11, here's the answer, and it's a crazy answer. Uriah said to the king, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. So he says the quiet part out loud there, by the way. But what an answer. Isn't that crazy? Like, you look at a guy like this who makes decisions like this. I don't know about you. Like, I'll just be honest with you. I'm not him. I would not have done that. Like, I would, even if the king would have said, hey, why don't you sleep on the mats by the servants? I'd been like, oh, I'm sneaking out. Actually, I would have visited my wife before the king. We went home first. Like, I am not Uriah. This is a totally different way of living. But there is something admirable about that. For him to say, man, this is how I make decisions. And think about what goes into that. We've already talked about it in this series, but clearly he is a man of honor, right? He is making decisions based off of what would honor God, honor the king, honor the general, honor his comrades at war. He's making that decision. Also, he's a man of discipline. He's not doing what he wants to do. He's doing what he believes is right. Because obviously he wants to go home. Obviously there's a pull there. But because of the principles and the code he lives by, he's saying, no, that's not the right thing to do. And he's got the discipline to say, I'm not doing it. He's also a man of loyalty. Think about the level of loyalty that goes into something like this. He's also got this idea that he's like caught up in something bigger than himself, and he wants to be a part of that. He wants to always be a part of that. He doesn't want to unplug from that. He's like, no, I'm a part of Israel. I'm a part of this campaign. I'm a part of this army, and I'm not going to let go of that. So all of that kind of goes into this decision. And again, I feel like there's something magnetic about that. I want to live like that. So Uriah says this to the king, and the king's sitting on the throne like with his eyebrows raised a little bit. And Uriah's looking at him. You ever notice how some people have, they call them micro expressions? If you have a good enough like self-awareness and you kind of, that emotional intelligence, you can see just a flash of a micro expression come across somebody's face if you're watching really close. And Uriah's watching the king, and like he's raising an eyebrow, and he thinks he catches a little bit of frustration, but that wouldn't make any sense, right? Why would the king be frustrated at a decision like this? So here's what the king says, verse 12. Then the king said to him, stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At the king's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and the king made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep in the mat among his master's servants, and he did not go home. So he stays, and the king invites him in to drink. And they're having a good time, and you have to imagine the kind of guy Uriah is. So he's super loyal. He obeys commands really well because he wants to be a part of this thing. And the king's drinking, and the king just keeps saying, fill his cup up, fill his cup up, fill his cup up. And Uriah's like too nice and loyal to the king to say, no, too much. So he keeps drinking, and the king, it says that the king got him drunk. And then he still doesn't go home. And that's crazy. By the way, I think that's an interesting thing about alcohol. Sometimes alcohol doesn't create a new thing in you. It just kind of reveals what was already there a little bit more. So here we learn that Uriah is more godly drunk than most of us are sober, right? That's amazing. And here's I think in this moment, what would have been really tempting for Uriah here is to say, hey, I have this code, these principles that I live by, but here's a circumstance that would cause me to say, well, because of that, I'm going to do something else. Do you ever have that happen in your life? Where you're like, hey, I want to live this certain way, but today I'm hungry, right? Or, hey, I want to do that, but today I had car trouble. Or I was going to live this way, but my kids acted this way in the morning. And we allow our circumstances to like throw us off from the ways we've decided to live. But Uriah's like, no. Even though the king got me drunk, I'm still going to live the way I've decided to live. I'm going to live by this code, these principles. I'm not giving that up. And again, I'm just drawn to this guy. I'm like, man, what a man. Like, that is so amazing. I want to live this way. So, king told him it's time to go back, sends him back to war. But before he leaves, the king writes a little letter, and he gives it to Uriah, and he says, hey, Uriah, take this to the general. So Uriah gets the letter, puts it in his pocket, gets his stuff, and he heads back to the front lines. I don't know about you, but I'd have been real tempted to read that. I don't know, high-level intelligence. I've been like, I'm just going to take a peek and see what's written in it just to see what our battle plans are. But again, if you look at who Uriah is, he won't do it. And we know for a fact that he doesn't read this letter. It doesn't say that he doesn't read the letter, but we know for a fact he doesn't read the letter. So he gets back, reports to Joab, hands him the letter, makes his way back to the campfire, and you can imagine what that's like. He joins in the campfire, sits down, hey, what's up, Uriah? How's the king? How's your wife? And then he tells them that he didn't go home, and they're like, what are you even doing? And he sits down, and they're having their little talk, kind of reunion, and all of a sudden, here comes Joab again into the light of the campfire. And he goes to Uriah, and he says, hey, tomorrow, you're attacking the toughest part of the city. And then Joab turns around and walks away. And I imagine the campfire got real quiet at that point. Ooh. Little stab of fear comes up into his chest. Like, ooh. But he's a warrior. Again, think about the code he lives by: honor, discipline, loyalty. He sets his jaw and is like, all right, tomorrow we're doing that. So he gets himself ready. And the next day they're attacking the city. And his assignment, his orders, don't make a ton of sense. He's being told to go real close to the wall, and real close to the wall is not a great idea because they have archers, and archers can hit us if we go that close to the wall. So the orders kind of don't make sense from Joab, but because Uriah is a loyal guy, and he's a disciplined guy, and he's a guy who obeys orders, he says, all right, we'll do it anyways. Joab must know what he's doing. So he charges. Now stop the story right here. Pause the movie. You've got a battle scene, all the sounds of war, arrows flying, men screaming, swords flashing, and here's Uriah drawing his sword and charging towards the wall. Pause. He's one of David's mighty men. Every story we have read up to this point has ended in an unexpected, amazing, odds-defying victory. You got lions getting slain. You got entire garrisons, entire armies being taken down by just a couple of guys. There's a theme here. If this is a series of movies, you're kind of excited at this point. You're like, all right, here we go. Man, he's gonna do something amazing here. He's gonna be like Neo, like dodging arrows. He's gonna be climbing the wall like Spider-Man. It's gonna be an amazing, amazing victory that he's about to have because the odds are way stacked against him here. You'd be really kind of excited. And then you unpause the movie. And he runs forward, fights valiantly, but an archer gets a line on him and hits him. A couple more. And he goes down. And Uriah the Hittite dies right there on that battlefield. And that just seems wrong, right? That's what? Like, if you're watching a movie, you're like, what? A guy who lived like that, a guy who had those kind of principles and that kind of discipline and lived by that kind of code, he's dead? He's just dead? That's not how the story should end. No, that's already a bad story, right? A guy like that, making decisions like that, living his life like that, dying like that. It sounds wrong, but believe it or not, the story is actually worse than I've told you. Because the story of Uriah the Hittite in the Bible actually goes by a different name. If you were looking it up and you go to 2 Samuel chapter 11 and you look at the little heading, it's not going to say Uriah the Hittite at the top of this story. What it's going to say at the top of the story is David and Bathsheba. That's the story. So what happened, what I didn't tell you, what's recorded in the Bible, is that if you back up to the beginning of this thing, Uriah goes out to war and King David stays home. And David goes up onto the roof of his palace and he looks down into Uriah's courtyard. That's how we know Uriah lived close to the palace. And he sees Uriah's wife named Bathsheba. And David, even though David could have had any woman in the kingdom that he wanted, he chooses to take Uriah's wife. And he brings her to the palace. And we don't know whether she was willing or not. We don't get the details of that. Certainly there's a power dynamic there between David and her. This seems messed up on all kinds of levels. So David takes her into his bedroom, and then she ends up pregnant, and David comes to this bad math equation in his head where he's like, wait a minute, the military campaign is going to last too long for Uriah to come home and for it to seem like it was actually his kid, so I'm going to have to call Uriah home. So that's why he calls one of his best warriors off of the front lines and brings him home. And then that's why he's like, hey, so how's the war going? Hey, why don't you go home to your wife? Here's a bottle of wine. And Uriah doesn't. And then David's frustrated, like, well, fine, if you won't drink the wine there, I'll make you drink the wine here, and then I'll send you home. And it still doesn't work. So David, frustrated, scared, writes a letter, and what was in that letter was David wrote to Joab, hey, Joab, send Uriah to the toughest part of the battle and retreat from him and make sure he dies. Seals it up and hands it to Uriah and says, give this to Joab. So Uriah carries his own death sentence back to the front lines, hands it to Joab, and ends up dead because of all that. Told you the story was horrible. Unfair, unjust, wrong. And the story's always told is like, well, David sinned. This is David's sin. Like, I'm a little insulted for Uriah that that's what we're talking about, that this the whole time the spotlight's on David. What about Uriah? The real story is that Uriah, this honorable, disciplined, loyal man, was betrayed, had his wife stolen, was treacherously murdered to cover it up. That's the story. And here's the worst part. The worst part of the story, if you actually think back through this, is it wouldn't have happened quite the same way if Uriah had been just a little less honorable, right? If he would have just said, you know what, I am going to go home. You know what, I'm not going to live by that code. I'm going to go home and visit my wife. If he would have just been a little less of the man God created him to be, he would have lived through this because David wouldn't have killed him. That's awful. Living the way God created him to live got him killed. A tragic hero. So again, if you're watching a movie, Uriah goes down, staring up at the sky, arrows in his chest, and you see the last breath, you're like, he's dead? Really? That's the story? He's dead? Like, dead. Yeah, he's dead. And you're like, that's the end of his story? And I want to say, well, no, it's not. How can he be dead and it not be the end of his story? Well, his death wasn't the end of his story. His death wasn't the end of his story. Such an important thing to believe. So consider for a moment. The moment Uriah takes an arrow to the chest, drops to the ground, and takes his last breath on this earth. The next moment, Uriah opens his eyes and takes his first breath in heaven. And just now we have to imagine that. So if you're watching a movie, it cuts from back down, arrows up in a field, to he's waking up, wandering toward the gates of heaven, and he kind of peeks in, and he sees like an army of angels. And the moment they see him, they just erupt in this the loudest cheering he's ever heard in his entire life. And he's like, whoa. And he sees the throne, and sitting on is the king, not a king, the king, capital T, capital K, the king. And he hears a voice from that throne, Uriah, you lived an honorable, loyal, disciplined life. Well done, good and faithful servant. And starts this enormous party. And what a moment that would be. And I don't want to like downplay that, how amazing that would be that that's what you get to experience the moment you die. Like you get to experience this amazing welcome. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you get to hear those words, well done, good and faithful servant. I mean, that will be worth everything. But I have to say that if you're watching this movie and you even got to see this scene, you'd be smiling, you'd be crying, you'd be like, wow, what a crazy thing. But there'd be a little something in the back of your mind like, wait a minute, is that really it? It feels like there's some storyline that's not yet done, right? It feels like the villain got away with it, right? Like back here, David's okay. Yeah, it's cool that Uriah has a nice story, but what about that? Now, kind of a side note. Some people have this assumption that the moment you die and you like get to heaven, that like you automatically just know everything. Like you just know everything. If you thought that, I'm not sure about that. I just want you to know the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say that like God gets a USB and like plugs it in like, oh, I know who killed JFK. Like you don't get to, it's not in the Bible. And I would say it doesn't really tell us how it all goes down, but I would just say based off of the way God seems to work in the Bible, that's probably not the way he's going to do it. God seems to like to progressively reveal things to us. He likes story and experience. I don't know that he's just going to download everything the moment you get there. And the reason I tell you that is because during this party and Uriah stepping into this amazing thing, I don't think he knows yet. He doesn't know. He knows he took some arrows to the chest. He knows he got some weird orders. He knows his interactions with the king felt a little funny, but he doesn't know. And here's what I believe. I believe that we each do get to have some time just one-on-one with God. And the reason I believe that is because God is infinite. And he doesn't have to like, hey, I'm sorry, you've got 10 minutes, like a doctor who's too busy to see you. God's infinite. He can spend time with us, all of us individually. He doesn't need to take time out of his day. So I think Uriah got to have a moment with God, to process life. And he sits down and starts talking to God. And God's like, hey, I got to tell you something. I got to tell you the whole story. And God tells him that his king, King David, betrayed him, stole his wife, made him carry his own death sentence, and killed him. And I imagine that would be a really hard thing to hear, even from God. And I imagine he broke down. And there's a moment, I don't know, again, this is conjecture, I don't know, I'm just kind of reading the Bible and kind of filling in some of the blanks as far as I think they would be filled, but I think God would just sit with you. At the end of your life, there's just a moment where God's just like, hey, why don't you just cry for as long as it takes? And I think Uriah would just be broken in that moment. And maybe God sits with you for 10 minutes or 10 hours or 10 years, however long it takes for you to kind of get all the pain of being alive on this earth out of you. And then maybe when Uriah's kind of done crying, you know what happens when you're done crying is you get angry. Maybe Uriah's like, God, what? David? Man after God's own heart? That one? Really? And I think he would be furious. God, this isn't right. You can't let that stand. He deserves to die for that. And I think in that moment, God, man, if he's not off his throne yet, he'd come down off his throne. And he's put his arm around Uriah, and he would be like, you know what? You're right. David did all that. David deserves to die. He does. Here's what I'm going to do, though. Uriah, listen. I'm going to die in his place. I'm going to go to earth. I'm going to be betrayed just like you were. I'm going to carry my own instrument of death just like you kind of did. And I'm going to be murdered just like you were. And I'm going to take David's sin onto myself. Man, I bet Uriah, knowing Uriah, he'd be like, no. Kings don't die for servants. Servants die for kings. You can't do that. And then maybe Uriah got the honor of God revealing his whole plan to him. No, Uriah, you don't understand. I'm not just going to go down there and die for David. I'm going to die for you too. I'm going to die for everybody. And that's what he does, right? A couple 100 years later, Jesus shows up on earth and he dies for David's sin. He dies for Uriah's sin. He dies for my sin, and he dies for your sin. And he takes the injustice and the unfairness and the evil and the senseless things that have happened throughout all of human history, and he takes them onto himself. And he tells Uriah the whole plan, the gospel. And then maybe in that moment, something finally shifts in Uriah's soul. He says, oh. And God helps him to his feet, and he wipes the tears off of his eye for the last time ever. And he says, come into the joy of your master. See, Uriah died on a battlefield thousands of years ago But his story didn't end on that field. That was the end of his story on earth, but it was only the beginning of the real story. All of his life, the betrayal, the adultery, the murder, that was like the title in the cover page to his story. That was nothing. Since he died, 3,000 years of the real story has been written of his existence. His story didn't have a happy ending down here on earth because it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the real story that God's been telling him for 3,000 years. You have to see this. You have to see this. So one of the quotes that has inspired me as I dug into this series was this idea, stop living as if the point of life is to arrive safely at death. Remember that? It was just a powerful quote. And I don't want to live like the point of life is to arrive safely at death. But in light of Uriah's story, I wrote a different one. Stop processing your pain as if eternity doesn't exist. Stop processing your pain as if eternity doesn't exist. So this is why this is so important to you. You're going to have things that are awful happen in your life. Some of you already do. You've got some deep, deep wounds in your life. Maybe you're going through one right now. And statistics tell me that there's a certain number of people every single year who kind of walk away from the faith, who just kind of give up on God, quit on God, like I can't do this anymore. There's a certain number of people that do that. And a decent percentage of them, the reason they walk away from God is because they got their bell rung. They had an awful thing happen. They had a tragedy. They had a death. They had a divorce. They had a betrayal. They had a thing. And whatever it was, they couldn't make sense of it. So they came to the conclusion, I got to walk away from God. I can't do this anymore. That's a good percentage of people who that's the reason they walk away. And this is why this is so important to you. Because I personally know people who had some bad things happen and they pushed away from God. They quit on him. And to me, this is the saddest reason, and I'm not trying to be like mean or overbearing to you, but quitting on God because something bad happens in your life, to me, that's the same as like reading the acknowledgments to a book. I dedicate this book to my wife. And you going, I don't want to read that anymore. When there's a whole book left, God's nowhere near done with your story. It's like walking into the beginning of the movie when like they're just now like putting the studio up that made the movie, and you're like, this movie is dumb, I'm leaving. Like it doesn't make any sense. You haven't even seen it yet. You don't even know what he's up to yet. It's too early. You're processing your pain as if eternity doesn't exist. And what that does is it puts you and God on very different timelines. Because you're like, hey, that happened, and I don't think there's any way you can fix this by the time I'm dead, God. And God's like, wasn't planning on it. Wasn't planning on that resolving before you died. Because God remembers that your life doesn't, your existence doesn't end when your life does. And you keep forgetting. Your story doesn't end when you die. Your whole life is like the cover page of your existence. Everything that happens after you die is the book. So I think it's crazy to walk away from God because you don't like the cover page when God's got a whole book in store. And I know that's cold. I understand that like I'm using logic right now and you're like, I'm not using my brain. I'm feeling right now and it hurts. And I get that. But I just don't want you to come to some conclusion. This hurts, God must not be real. This hurts, God must not love me. Hold on. Hold on. He's not done yet. And he's not even done when you die. Stop. That's a bad equation you're making decisions with. Look at what Paul said in Romans chapter 8, verse 18. Yet what we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory he will reveal to us later. And Paul had it rough, by the way. The guy who wrote this, he had a lot of suffering in his life. And he's like, hey, put all that on a scale. Put all your suffering on a scale. The worst things that have ever happened to you, put it on a scale. And yeah, you're like, well, that's a lot. I've got a lot of pain in my life. I've got a lot of things that didn't go the way I wanted. I've got a lot of betrayal. I've got a lot of unhealed wounds here. And Paul's like, yeah, I bet that's heavy. But then he's like, yeah, but compare it to the glory that God's going to reveal on the other side of your death. And he's like, put that over here, and he's like, this weighs nothing compared to that. What God has in store after you die is so overwhelming that this becomes nothing. Nothing. That all your pain is a drop, and what God has in store is the ocean. All your pain is a grain of sand, and what God has in store is the Sahara Desert. All your pain is a snowflake, and what God has in store is the Arctic. It's nothing compared to what he has in store for you. And if Uriah were here, he'd tell you that. He'd tell you that. And on one hand, I want to say Uriah had it worse than you have. I bet you haven't had all that. But as I was thinking about it, I bet there's some people in here going, no, I'm a little jealous of him, actually. Because he didn't find out about the betrayal until he was already dead. I have to live with it. I have to try and not hate. I have to try and hold on to God even though I'm still going, and it's hard. I get that. But I wish I could just inject this into your veins. This is going to sound crazy. But in your worst pain, there is a crazy spiritual opportunity. Crazy one. One that you can't have any other place than your worst pain. So C.S. Lewis wrote this book called The Screwtape Letters, and it's this idea, it's a satire of a demon writing a letter to another demon who's trying to tempt a human. And the senior level demon is giving advice to this demon. And they're talking about different ways to tempt, different ways to mess with the human. And it's a very fascinating read. And one of the lines I think that is the most powerful says this: our cause is never in more danger than when a human, no longer desiring but intending to do God's will, looks around upon a universe from which every trace of God seems to have vanished and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys. So the demon's like, hey, they're not that afraid of us when things are going well. The demons aren't. They're like, when your life is going good and you're praising God, they're like, that's fine, we can deal with that. But he's saying, hey, the scariest part for the bad guys in the story, the scariest part for the darkness in this world is when you're at your worst, when you are at the worst moment of your life, when the pain is at its highest. And you turn to God and you say, you're still good. You're still good. You're still worthy to be worshiped even in this dark moment. That is like a knockout punch to the devil. He can't handle that. That you would enter the throne room of God in your worst moment and say, I still love you. I still want to serve you. I still want to obey you. Satan doesn't know what to do with that. You become something completely other to him. And heaven erupts in that. That is the highest praise you can give. So in your worst moments, you have the opportunity for the highest praise. The highest of the highest of the highest. No offense if things are going really well right now, your ceiling's lower. But if you've got things going really bad right now, if things are really hurting right now, you have the highest ceiling ever to praise God. And in my opinion, that is worth more than anything, more than anything. And I think when you look back on that moment, thousands of years later, you're gonna be like, that was the most important moment of my life. When I didn't walk away, when I didn't push away, when I didn't give up on God, even when it hurt, even when it was the worst. I praised him anyways. I leaned into him anyways. Don't push away. If you're in that place right now, allow God to deepen your faith. Lean in closer. Trust his plan. Trust that his plan is bigger than your whole life. His plan is bigger than your whole life. You won't regret it. Let's pray. Lord, I want to pray for the person who's hurting right now, or the person who's still bleeding from that thing that happened to them, and they never really processed it all the way. Lord, I pray that we would be very, very aware of eternity right now. I pray for the person who's hurting that they would feel your presence in a way they've not felt it yet. I pray that you would draw their heart to you, that they would have the strength to stand up under the weight of it and still praise you. still say you're good, and trust that your plan is bigger than their whole life. I pray for the person in this room who's on the verge of walking away from you, Lord. I pray that this would be the thing that stops them right here, that you would get a hold of their heart right here, right now. I pray that we would not live as people who don't remember eternity. I pray for that pain that is coming in some of our lives, Lord. Some of us haven't even hit it yet. That we would remember eternity in that. Remember that you took all of the pain, all of the sorrow, all of the catastrophe, the hurt in this world. You took it onto yourself on that cross for us so that we could have a relationship with you, and that you will one day come back and fix this thing. Pray that hope would blossom in our souls. So the worship team's going to come up here and they're going to sing a song, and I want to invite you, especially if you're hurting, to have a moment with God. You could open up your mouth and praise him right now, and I think that would be worth so much, an eternal value in you praising him even in this moment. But maybe you need some prayer right now. We're going to have our prayer partners come up on the sides, and if you need somebody to pray with you, if you need somebody to process some stuff or just cry with you, they will be here as we're singing. You can come up and do that. But I challenge you to open up your mouth and praise him right now.